They sold the world happiness in a glass, but paid for it with the funerals of their own children. Fame was supposed to be a shield. Instead, it painted a target on their backs for assassins. To this day, the opening line of one of history's greatest songs is about one of their heirs blowing his mind out in a car, and the whole world still sings along. This is the Guinness curse. So, how many tragedies does it take to turn a dream into a nightmare? Ireland in the mid-17th century was a land of stark contrasts and simmering tensions, a kingdom in its own right, but one increasingly subordinate to the will of its powerful English neighbor. The island was governed by the Protestant ascendancy, a wealthy land-owning minority class descended from English and Scottish settlers who were loyal to the British crown. They controlled the parliament in Dublin, the courts, the military, and virtually all the wealth and power, ruling over a disenfranchised and largely impoverished Catholic majority who were barred by the penal laws from owning land, holding public office, or even educating their children in their own faith. It was a world defined by deep-seated religious and social divides, a precarious society where ambition was a dangerous game. It was into this world that Arthur Guinness was born in 1725, in the small village of Shelbridge in County Kildare. He was not a member of the Grand Ascendancy, but he was a Protestant, which gave him a crucial foothold on the ladder of society. His father, Richard Guinness, held a respectable position as a land steward for the Archbishop of Cashel, a powerful and influential cleric named Dr. Arthur Price. This connection would prove to be the single most important factor in the family's fortunes. Young Arthur grew up on the Archbishop's estate, and it is said that his father supervised the estate's brewery. It was here, amidst the mash tuns and copper kettles of a provincial brewery, that Arthur likely learned the fundamentals of his future trade. He watched, he learned, and he nurtured a quiet but burning ambition that went far beyond the confines of his station. The decisive moment came in 1752. On his death, Archbishop Price, who was also Arthur's godfather, left a bequest in his will that would change history. He left the surprisingly generous sum of £100 to his godson, Arthur Guinness, and another £100 to his father, Richard. In an era where a skilled tradesman might earn £20 or £30 in a year, this was a life-altering amount of capital. It was a ticket to a new life, a chance to become a master of his own destiny. With this inheritance, Arthur didn't buy a small farm or seek a comfortable administrative post. He went into business for himself. In 1755, at the age of 30, he leased a small brewery in the nearby town of Leelip. It was a modest beginning, but it was his. Here, for 4 years, he honed his craft, brewing traditional Irish ales, building a local reputation for quality, and, most importantly, learning the intricacies of the trade. But his gaze was fixed on a much bigger prize, the bustling, chaotic, and perpetually thirsty city of Dublin. Dublin in the 1750s was the second city of the British Empire, a thriving, handsome, and often brutal metropolis. Grand Georgian squares and elegant townhouses were rising, symbols of the ascendancy's wealth, but they existed alongside some of the most wretched slums in Europe. It was a city of culture and squalor, of high society and desperate poverty, and it was a city that drank. Alehouses and taverns were everywhere, the centers of social and political life. For an ambitious brewer, Dublin was the ultimate market. In 1759, Arthur made his move. He left the Leixlip brewery to his younger brother and traveled to Dublin in search of an opportunity. He found it on the western edge of the city, at a place called St. James's Gate. Here stood a small 4-acre brewery that had fallen on hard times. It was dilapidated, poorly equipped, and had ceased operations. The water supply from the city was unreliable and had been a source of constant dispute. Most observers would have seen a failed business and a bad investment. Arthur Guinness saw the foundation of an empire. He approached the owners, the Rainsford family, and began negotiations. He must have been an incredibly persuasive negotiator, because the deal he struck is now the stuff of corporate legend, a testament to his staggering self-belief and long-term vision. He signed a lease, not for 21 years, the standard term at the time, not for 99 years, a period that would have seemed an eternity. Arthur Guinness signed a lease for 9,000 years. The annual rent was fixed at a mere £45 forever. It was one of the most audacious, far-sighted, and frankly bizarre business deals in history. It was a supreme act of faith in his own abilities and in the future of his product. The 9,000-year term gave him something that no other entrepreneur could dream of: absolute security. It meant that no matter how vast or successful his brewery became, no landlord could ever raise the rent, renegotiate the terms, or threaten to evict him. He was free to invest, to build, to expand, with the cast-iron certainty that his descendants for 300 generations would reap the rewards. He wasn't just leasing a property, he was claiming a piece of Dublin for his family forever. Having secured his brewery, Arthur faced his first major challenge: the water. The Dublin Corporation, which controlled the city's water supply, was notoriously difficult. They often cut off the brewery's supply or demanded exorbitant fees. In one famous incident in 1775, the corporation sent a sheriff with a party of men to physically seize his water source and fill it in. The 50-year-old Arthur, a man of formidable character, is said to have confronted the party himself, seizing a pickaxe from a workman and furiously declaring that they would have to take his life before they took his water. His ferocity and determination won the day, and he eventually secured a permanent water grant, solving the problem for good. Initially, Arthur brewed the common ales of the day, but his true genius lay in his ability to spot a trend and capitalize on it. A new type of beer was becoming wildly popular in London, a dark, rich, and heavily hopped brew called porter. It was so named because it was the favored drink of the city's street and river porters, who valued its strong, nourishing qualities. The trend soon spread to Dublin, and several local brewers began to produce their own versions. Arthur watched, tasted, and calculated. He saw that this was the future. In a bold and risky move, he decided to stop brewing traditional ales altogether. In 1799, he brewed his last ale and dedicated his entire operation at St. James's Gate to perfecting a single product, his own distinctive version of porter. He developed a recipe that set his brew apart. The key innovation was the use of roasted barley, which was malted at a high temperature. This gave his porter a darker, almost black color, a characteristic bitter taste, and a rich roasted flavor that was more intense than its London rivals. It also produced the thick, creamy, and remarkably stable head of foam that would one day become the beer's most famous visual signature. This was no longer just an Irish copy of a London fashion, it was a superior product. Dubliners agreed. Demand for Guinness's porter, or simply the black stuff, soared. Arthur had found his niche. He was not just a master brewer. He was a shrewd businessman and a committed social and political figure. He was a staunch unionist, a fervent supporter of the Act of Union in 1801, which formally merged the Kingdom of Ireland with Great Britain. He was deeply conservative in his politics and a devout Protestant, championing causes like Sunday school education. He was also a prolific family man. He and his wife, Olivia Whitmore, had an astonishing 21 children, a testament to the high mortality rates of the era. Only 10 of them, however, survived to adulthood. He ran his family with the same firm hand as his business, instilling in his sons a powerful sense of Protestant work ethic, civic duty, and dynastic ambition. When he finally died in 1803 at the age of 78, he was a hugely respected figure in Dublin. He had started with a 100-pound inheritance and built one of the most successful businesses in Ireland, leaving behind a fortune of £25,000 and a brewery poised for greatness. He had laid the foundation stone. His sons would now build the cathedral. The 19th century was the era in which Guinness transformed from a successful Dublin business into a global industrial titan. The mantle of leadership passed to Arthur's son, Arthur Guinness II. A more cautious and methodical man than his father, he steered the company through the turbulent years of the Napoleonic Wars. Ironically, the wars proved to be a huge benefit to the brewery. The British naval blockade disrupted the supply of porter from London to Ireland, effectively handing Guinness a monopoly on the Irish market. Arthur II capitalized on this, expanding production and refining the brewing process. He introduced scientific methods, employing hydrometers and thermometers to ensure consistent quality, a revolutionary practice at the time. He also began to seriously develop the export market, shipping his stout, a stronger version of porter, to England and beyond. By the time he handed over control to the next generation, he had grown the business tenfold, but it was the third generation in the form of Arthur II's son, Benjamin Lee Guinness, who would elevate the family from wealthy merchants to industrial royalty. Born in 1798, Benjamin Lee was a man of immense energy and vision, a true titan of the Victorian age. He inherited sole control of the brewery in 1855 and presided over its most explosive period of growth. He fully embraced the power of the Industrial Revolution, investing vast sums in the latest technology. He built his own railway network within the brewery to move barrels and raw materials, and he harnessed the power of steam engines to drive a massive expansion of the plant. Under Benjamin Lee Guinness, St. James's Gate expanded to over 60 acres, one of the largest breweries in the world and a marvel of Victorian industry. It was a city within a city, with its own cooperage, its own engineering works, its own fire brigade, and its own medical service. It employed thousands of Dubliners, making the Guinness family the largest private employer in Ireland. The family's wealth grew to almost unimaginable proportions. They were no longer just brewers, they were a financial powerhouse. And with this wealth came a profound sense of civic responsibility. Benjamin Lee Guinness became one of Dublin's greatest patrons. He served as Member of Parliament for Dublin City from 1865 to 1868 and was created a baronet in 1867 for his public works, a position he used to champion improvements in the city's infrastructure. His most famous act of philanthropy, however, was a gesture of monumental scale and deep symbolic significance. For centuries, St. Patrick's Cathedral, the historic National Cathedral of Ireland, had been slowly falling into ruin. Its walls were crumbling, its roof was leaking, and it was in danger of complete collapse. The Church of Ireland, to which it belonged, was too poor to fund the necessary repairs. In 1860, Benjamin Lee Guinness stepped in. He offered to personally finance the entire restoration of the cathedral, a project of enormous complexity and expense. The final cost came to over £150,000, a sum so vast it is difficult to comprehend in modern terms. It was an act of incredible generosity, but it was also a powerful political statement. Here was a Protestant industrialist, a pillar of the Unionist establishment, pouring a fortune into preserving a medieval cathedral that was a cornerstone of the entire island's heritage, revered by Catholics and Protestants alike. It was a gesture that cemented the Guinness family's status as the unofficial royalty of Dublin, transcending the bitter sectarian divides of the time. Benjamin's sons, Arthur Edward, later Lord Ardilaun, and Edward Cecil, later Lord Ivia, continued the family's ascent. They were brilliant businessmen who oversaw the company's continued growth, but they also used their immense wealth to live on a scale of aristocratic grandeur. They bought vast country estates, built magnificent London mansions, and filled them with priceless art collections, including works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Gainsborough. They became major figures in British high society and politics, epitomizing the confidence and power of the late Victorian era. The single most important financial decision of the century came in 1886. Edward Cecil Guinness, a financial visionary, decided to take the company public. He floated Guinness on the London Stock Exchange, a move that unleashed its value and turned the family's already enormous fortune into something truly astronomical. The share issue was massively oversubscribed. Everyone wanted a piece of the black stuff. Overnight, the Guinness family became one of the wealthiest families in the world, on a par with the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. The money from the flotation allowed Edward Cecil, now Lord Eva, to embark on an unparalleled campaign of philanthropy. He established the Guinness Trust and later the IV Trust in Dublin, which built vast tracts of clean, affordable housing for the poor in London and Dublin, charitable works that continue to this day. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Guinness dynasty had reached a seemingly unassailable peak. They had created a product that was a global phenomenon. They had built the largest and most profitable brewery in the world. They were aristocrats, politicians, philanthropists, and patrons of the arts. They had achieved everything Arthur Guinness could have dreamed of, and more. From the outside, their story was a perfect, unbroken arc of success, a testament to hard work, innovation, and civic virtue. But as the new century dawned, a different kind of story began to unfold. The immense public profile, the political power, and the staggering wealth that the family had accumulated would begin to attract a different kind of attention, a darker kind of fate. The age of triumph was slowly, imperceptibly, giving way to an age of tragedy. The whispers of a family curse, once a fanciful notion, were about to find their voice in the violent, chaotic events of the century to come. The first devastating blow to the Guinness dynasty in the 20th century was not a quiet family tragedy whispered about in drawing rooms, nor was it a failure in the boardroom. It was a brutal, public, and highly political act of violence that reverberated from the dusty streets of Cairo to the hallowed halls of Westminster, shaking the British Empire to its core. It was an event that announced to the world that the Guinness name, for so long a symbol of industry, philanthropy, and aristocracy, now also made its bearer a target. The man at the center of this geopolitical storm was Walter Edward Guinness, the first Baron Moyne, a figure who embodied the pinnacle of the family's integration into the British establishment, and whose death would become a bloody chapter in the violent birth of a new nation. Born in Dublin in 1880, Walter Guinness was the third son of Edward Cecil Guinness, the first Earl of Iveagh, the financial genius who had taken the company public and amassed one of the world's great fortunes. Walter was, in every sense, a product of his class and time. Educated at the prestigious Eton College, he moved effortlessly through the upper echelons of society. He was not destined to run the brewery. That responsibility fell to his elder brother, so he pursued the other great calling of his class, public service and military duty. His youth was marked by adventure and conflict. He volunteered for service in the Second Boer War in South Africa, a formative experience for many young men of his generation. When the Great War erupted in 1914, he again answered the call, serving with distinction in the Suffolk Yeomanry. He fought at the disastrous Gallipoli campaign and later on the Western Front at Passchendaele, one of the most horrific battles in human history. He was wounded, mentioned in dispatches multiple times for his courage, and awarded the Distinguished Service Order, a testament to his bravery under fire. After the war, he embarked on a long and respectable political career as a Conservative Member of Parliament, representing the constituency of Bury St. Edmunds for nearly a quarter of a century. He was a capable and diligent administrator, holding several cabinet positions, including Financial Secretary to the Treasury, and most notably, Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries. He was not a political firebrand or a charismatic orator, but a steady, reliable, and deeply establishment figure, a man who believed in the institutions of empire, crown, and parliament. In 1932, his service was rewarded when he was elevated to the peerage, taking the title Baron Moyne of Bury St. Edmunds and moving to the House of Lords. Beyond politics, Moyne was a man of wide-ranging interests. He was a keen naturalist and anthropologist, undertaking ambitious scientific expeditions around the world on his private yacht, the Rosora, collecting zoological specimens and ethnographic artifacts from New Guinea to Greenland. He was, by all accounts, a man of immense privilege and considerable accomplishment. A world away from the simmering resentments and fanatical ideologies that were coalescing into a deadly threat in the Middle East. To understand what happened to Lord Moyne and why, we must first understand the powder keg that was Mandatory Palestine in the 1940s. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, Britain was granted a mandate by the League of Nations to govern the territory. This was an almost impossible task from the outset. The 1917 Balfour Declaration, a short but momentous letter from the British Foreign Secretary, had promised British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. However, it also contained a crucial and contradictory caveat that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. These two promises, one to the Zionists and one to the Arabs, were fundamentally irreconcilable. As Jewish immigration to Palestine increased throughout the 1920s and 30s, driven by a fervent desire to build a new nation and escape rising anti-Semitism in Europe, tensions with the majority Arab population escalated dramatically, frequently erupting into riots and violence. By the late 1930s, the situation had reached a crisis point. The rise of Nazi Germany and the passing of the Nuremberg Laws had created a desperate exodus of Jews from Europe. They were a people facing annihilation, and for many, Palestine was their only hope, their only potential refuge. Yet Britain, facing a full-scale Arab revolt in Palestine from 1936 to 1939, and fearing the loss of Arab support and vital oil supplies on the eve of another world war, made a fateful policy decision. In May 1939, the government of Neville Chamberlain issued a policy document known as the White Paper. It was a devastating blow to Zionist aspirations. The White Paper effectively repudiated the idea of a Jewish state, instead envisioning an independent Palestine governed jointly by Arabs and Jews. And most critically, it imposed draconian restrictions on Jewish immigration, limiting it to a total of just 75,000 people over the next 5 years, with any further immigration subject to Arab consent, which everyone knew would not be forthcoming. To the Jews of Europe and the Zionist leadership, the White Paper of 1939 was a death sentence. At the very moment their people were facing genocide, the British were locking the gates to their promised homeland. It was seen as an act of unforgivable betrayal, a cynical geopolitical calculation that sacrificed Jewish lives for imperial interests. The policy turned a significant portion of the Jewish population in Palestine, the Yishuv, against the British authorities, while most mainstream Zionist organizations, led by figures like Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, chose a path of political opposition and clandestine immigration. More radical factions concluded that the British would only respond to one thing: force. This toxic environment gave rise to a number of underground Jewish militant groups. The largest was the Irgun, which had launched a campaign of attacks against Arab targets during the revolt. But the most extreme, the most ruthless, and the most ideologically uncompromising was a small splinter group known as Lehi, an acronym for Lohame Herut Israel, Fighters for the Freedom of Israel. To the British, they were known by a more sinister name, the Stern Gang, after their charismatic, messianic, and ultimately doomed founder, Avraham Stern. Leahy's ideology was simple and brutal. They viewed the British Mandate as an illegal foreign occupation. They considered every British official, soldier, and policeman in Palestine a legitimate target. They believed that only a relentless campaign of personal terror, assassinations, bombings, and armed attacks could drive the British out and pave the way for a Jewish state. They were fanatics, patriots, or terrorists, depending on one's perspective, but their commitment to violence was absolute. In early 1944, with the tide of World War II turning in the Allies' favor, Lord Moyne was appointed British Minister of State for the Middle East. Based in Cairo, the nerve center of British power in the region, he was the highest-ranking British official in this critical theater of war. His role was to coordinate political and diplomatic strategy across the vast territory. To the leaders of Lehi, this made him the perfect target. In their eyes, Lord Moyne was not just another colonial administrator. He was the living embodiment of the hated British policy that was condemning their people to the death camps of Europe. He was viewed by Lehi as the British official enforcing the 1939 White Paper that restricted Jewish immigration, though he had not authored the policy. They decided he had to die. His assassination, they believed, would be a dramatic act of political theater, a warning to the British that there would be a price for their betrayal, a bloody statement that would force the world to pay attention to their cause. The mission was planned with cold-blooded precision. The assassins chosen for the task were two young men, their minds forged in the crucible of extremist ideology. Eliyahu Betzuri was 22, a thoughtful and well-read man who provided the intellectual justification for their actions. Eliyahu Hakim was just 2, a boy filled with a burning, righteous anger. They traveled from Palestine to Cairo, where they spent weeks meticulously studying Lord Moyne's movements, his daily routine, the route his car took to and from his residence in the wealthy suburb of Zamalek. The afternoon of November 6, 1944, was hot and dusty. Lord Moyne had finished his work at his office and was being driven home. His car, a standard military-issue Humber, pulled up to the curb outside his villa. As it came to a stop, the two young assassins sprang their trap. They had been waiting, disguised as locals, loitering near the entrance. Hakim ran to the passenger side of the car and yanked the door open. He stood face to face with the 64-year-old British minister. Without hesitation, he fired his revolver 3 times at point-blank range. Simultaneously, Betzuri moved to the front of the car and fired at the driver, Lance Corporal Arthur Fuller, a 35-year-old soldier who was also acting as Moyne's bodyguard. Fuller was killed instantly. The two assassins, their mission accomplished, jumped on their bicycles and attempted to flee into the chaotic Cairo traffic. The attack, however, had not gone unnoticed. An Egyptian police constable on traffic duty nearby, El Amin Mohammed Abdullah, heard the shots and saw the two men cycling away. He commandeered a motorcycle and gave chase. He cornered them in a side street and, despite being unarmed himself, bravely confronted them. They were quickly overpowered and arrested. Lord Moyne, meanwhile, was bleeding profusely from wounds to his neck, abdomen, and chest. He was rushed to a British military hospital where surgeons fought to save his life, but his injuries were too severe. He died on the operating table that evening. The assassination sent shockwaves of outrage across the Allied world. In London, the news was met with disbelief and fury. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had long been a personal friend of Lord Moyne and a consistent, powerful supporter of the Zionist cause, was incandescent with rage. He saw the murder as a monstrous act of ingratitude and a catastrophic political blunder. Standing before a stunned House of Commons, he delivered one of the most blistering condemnations of his career, declaring, "This villainy must be stamped out. If our dreams for Zionism are to end in the smoke of assassins' pistols, and our labors for its future to produce only a new set of gangsters worthy of Nazi Germany, then many like myself will have to reconsider the position we have maintained so consistently and so long in the past." The threat was clear. The actions of the extremists could jeopardize the entire project of a Jewish state. The assassination was equally devastating for the mainstream Zionist leadership. Figures like Chaim Weizmann, president of the World Zionist Organization, were horrified. They knew the attack would destroy their credibility with the British government and alienate their most crucial allies at the very moment they needed them most. They issued a swift and unequivocal condemnation of the murder, and in a controversial move, the leadership of the Yishuv launched a campaign known as the Saison, or hunting season, actively cooperating with the British authorities to hunt down and expose members of Lehi and the Irgun. The assassination had laid bare the deep, bitter, and violent divisions within the Zionist movement itself. The trial of Bet Zuri and Hakim, held before an Egyptian military court in early 1945, became a political spectacle. The two young men showed no remorse. On the contrary, they used the courtroom as a platform to defiantly proclaim their ideology and denounce British imperialism. In a fiery and articulate speech that was reported around the world, Bet Zuri declared, "We do not recognize the authority of this court. My crime is that I desire that my nation should be free. My crime is that I wanted the suffering of my people to end. We were forced to do what we did, and by our act we want to shout to the whole world, we have a right to live. We have a right to a homeland." Their defiance was absolute, but their fate was sealed. They were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Despite some last-minute appeals for clemency, they were hanged in Cairo on March 23, 1945. To this day, their legacy remains deeply controversial. To the world at large and to many Israelis, they were terrorists who murdered a diplomat. But to a hardline nationalist minority, they are revered as heroic martyrs who sacrificed their lives in the war for Israel's independence. In 1975, their bodies were returned to Israel, where they were reburied with full military honors on Mount Herzl, the nation's military cemetery. For the Guinness family, the assassination was a profound and brutal shock. It was a private grief that had become a public spectacle, a personal loss that was now a footnote in the bloody history of the Middle East. Their name, once associated primarily with beer, philanthropy, and society, was now irrevocably linked to international terrorism and the violent death throes of the British Empire. The loss of Walter Guinness was not just a bereavement, it was a terrifying confirmation that their immense public profile made them vulnerable in ways they had never before imagined. The vague, whispered notion of a family curse, a dark superstition that clung to their great fortune, suddenly seemed to have a chilling concrete form. It was a curse that could reach across continents, a curse that could strike them down, not through accident or illness, but through the barrel of an assassin's gun in a foreign land. The age of innocence was over. If the assassination of Lord Moyne was a tragedy of global politics and the dying convulsions of empire, the next great misfortune to befall the Guinness dynasty was a product of a new and radically different age. It was a tragedy of youth, celebrity, beauty, and the hedonistic high-octane excesses of the swinging 60s. This chapter of the family's story does not unfold in the corridors of power, but in the exclusive salons of London's counterculture and within the enchanted, melancholic grounds of a breathtaking Irish estate. It revolves around two magnetic centers of gravity: a place, Lugala, which became a bohemian paradise, and a person, a young man, who for a brief shining moment embodied the very spirit of his time. His name was Tara Brown. To understand Tara, you must first understand the world that shaped him, a world presided over by his mother, Una Guinness. Una, born in 1910, was the youngest of the three legendary Golden Guinness girls, the daughters of Ernest Guinness. Alongside her sisters, Aileen and Maureen, she was a celebrated beauty and a leading light of London society in the Roaring Twenties. The sisters were the it girls of their day, their lives a whirlwind of debutante balls, society weddings, and glamorous parties, all breathlessly reported in the gossip columns of magazines like Tatler and The Sketch. Una was perhaps the most enchanting of the three, possessing a wit and a charisma that drew people to her like moths to a flame. In 1937, as a wedding present from her father, Una was given Lugala, a stunning Gothic revival lodge, nestled in a secluded glacial valley in the Wicklow Mountains, about an hour south of Dublin. The estate is a place of almost mythic beauty. The house itself, with its crenellated towers and mock fortifications, looks like a fairy tale castle in miniature. It sits at the head of Lough Tay, a dark, brooding lake whose northern shore is edged with a beach of startlingly white sand, imported by the family, which gives it the local nickname, the Guinness Lake. Surrounded by steep, heather-clad mountains, Lugala feels completely cut off from the modern world, a secret kingdom governed by its own rules. And under Una's stewardship, that is precisely what it became. Una, who eventually became Lady Oranmore Brown through her third marriage, transformed Lugala into a bohemian paradise, a private haven for an eclectic and glittering mix of the world's artistic and intellectual elite. From the 1950s onwards, to receive an invitation to Lugala was to be welcomed into the inner sanctum of high Bohemia. The guest list was a staggering who's who of 20th century culture. The great Irish poet Seamus Heaney found inspiration in its moody landscapes. The famously hard-drinking Dublin writer Brendan Behan was a frequent and often chaotic guest. The painter Lucian Freud, a notoriously intense and demanding personality, was a close friend and regular visitor, capturing the brooding atmosphere of the estate in his work. The actor John Hurt practically became part of the family. Later, as the 60s dawned, a new generation of cultural royalty was drawn into Lugala's orbit. Rock stars like Mick Jagger and his girlfriend Marianne Faithfull, who would come to escape the pressures of fame. Life at La Gala was a performance with Una as its dazzling director. It was a place of endless, lavish hospitality where the normal conventions of society were joyfully suspended. Lunches would drift into dinners, which would drift into late-night drinking sessions around a roaring fire, fueled by brilliant conversation, sharp wit, and copious amounts of Guinness and champagne. Creativity, intellectual debate, and unrestrained revelry were the orders of the day. La Gala was enchanting, a place of immense artistic freedom and breathtaking natural beauty, but for all its glamour and vitality, a profound and unshakable melancholy seemed to cling to the estate, a sense of sorrow that mirrored the heartbreaks of its chatelaine. Una's life, for all its external sparkle, was marked by deep recurring tragedy. Her marriages were turbulent. Her second husband, from whom she had separated, died in a sanatorium. Her third marriage to Lord Oranmore and Brown would also end in separation. But the deepest wounds were the loss of her children. In the 1950s, her beloved 14-year-old daughter, Tessa, died suddenly and unexpectedly from pneumonia while at school. The loss was a blow from which Una never fully recovered, a grief that shadowed the rest of her life. The glittering, non-stop party at La Gala often seemed like a beautiful, frantic, and ultimately desperate attempt to keep a deep-seated sadness at bay. It was into this extraordinary world, a world of dazzling privilege, artistic genius, and hidden private sorrow, that her son, Tara Brown, was born in 1945. Tara Brown was the son of Una Guinness and her third husband, Dominic Brown, the fourth Baron Oranmore and Brown. As a Guinness heir on his mother's side and a member of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy on his father's, Tara was born into the highest echelons of society. He was destined for a life of immense privilege, but he was never going to be a conventional aristocrat. He was a creature of his time, a face of the new generation that was tearing up the rule book of post-war Britain. Growing up between La Gala and London, Tara was handsome, impossibly charming, and possessed of a restless, creative energy. He became a leading figure, a face in the nascent counterculture movement of swinging London. This was a time of unprecedented social and cultural upheaval. A new generation, the first to grow up free from the shadow of war and austerity, was challenging every aspect of the old, stuffy British establishment. Music, fashion, art, and social attitudes were being revolutionized, and London was the white-hot epicenter of this cultural explosion. Tara Brown was right at its heart. He was a trendsetter, a socialite who seemed to know everyone worth knowing. He was close friends with Brian Jones, the flamboyant and ultimately tragic founder of the Rolling Stones. He moved in the same exclusive circles as the Beatles and was particularly friendly with Paul McCartney and John Lennon. He was a regular at the most fashionable clubs, like the Ad Lib and the Scotch of St. James, the nocturnal playgrounds of the new rock aristocracy. He was a style icon, famously commissioning the Dutch art collective, The Fool, to paint his AC Cobra sports car in a vibrant psychedelic mural. When he came into his Guinness inheritance on turning 18, he embraced the freedom it gave him with joyous and some would say reckless abandon. When he turned 21 in March 1966, he threw a now legendary birthday party at La Gala. It was a 2-day psychedelic extravaganza, a meeting of the old bohemian world and the new. He flew over 2 of the hottest bands of the moment, the Lovin' Spoonful from America and the Pretty Things from Britain, to perform for a guest list that included Mick Jagger, Brian Jones, and a host of other beautiful young things. It was the social event of the year, a symbol of Tara's status as a prince of the swinging London scene. He was living life at full throttle, a life of fast cars, beautiful women, all-night parties, and psychedelic experimentation. He embodied the spirit of the 1960s, the rejection of convention, the embrace of the new, and the intoxicating, dangerous pursuit of pleasure and experience. But the very lifestyle that made him an icon was fraught with peril. The world he inhabited, for all its glamour, was as dangerous as it was exciting. On the night of December 17, 1966, just 9 months after his celebrated 21st birthday, Tara was driving through the elegant London neighborhood of South Kensington. He was at the wheel of his new sports car, a light blue Lotus Elan, one of the fastest and most fashionable cars of the era. In the passenger seat was his girlfriend, the 18-year-old model Suki Poitier. They were heading to the house of the artist David Vaughan, where they were due to discuss a design for a new boutique Tara was planning to open. What happened next, at the junction of Redcliffe Square and Redcliffe Gardens, is a matter of some historical debate. The official inquest reported that Tara simply failed to see a stationary vehicle, but eyewitness accounts and the accepted story that has passed into legend suggest a more dramatic scenario. A white Volkswagen is said to have pulled out unexpectedly from a side street directly into his path. Tara, who was reportedly traveling at a very high speed, had a split second to react. He swerved violently to avoid the Volkswagen. The Lotus, a small and lightweight car, spun out of control and slammed with ferocious force into a parked lorry. The impact was catastrophic. Tara Brown was gravely injured and died the next day in hospital. He was just 21 years old. In a final, heartbreaking act of heroism or instinct, the swerve he made had taken the full force of the impact on the driver's side, shielding his passenger. Miraculously, Suki Poitier survived the crash with relatively minor injuries. The news of the handsome, vibrant young Guinness heir's death sent a shockwave through London society. It was a tragic, brutal, and seemingly senseless end to a life of such dazzling promise. For his mother Una, back at La Gala, the news was an unthinkable, soul-crushing blow, the second of her children to be taken from her far, far too soon. The light and laughter of Lugala were extinguished by a grief that would never truly lift. The story of Tara Brown's death might have faded into a sad footnote in the society columns of the day, another cautionary tale about the perils of youth and fast cars. But it was destined to be immortalized, transformed from a personal tragedy into a piece of global culture by one of his most famous acquaintances, John Lennon. A few weeks after the crash, in early 1967, Lennon was at his home in Surrey sitting at his piano idly reading the Daily Mail newspaper. His eye was caught by two completely disconnected stories on the page. One was a small, dry report detailing the coroner's inquest into the death of Tara Brown. The other was a short article about a bizarre plan to fix the alarming number of potholes in the roads of Blackburn, Lancashire. 4,000 of them, to be precise. In a moment of surrealist, associative genius that only he was capable of, Lennon's mind fused these two mundane news items, a high society tragedy and a piece of provincial trivia, into the astonishing opening verse of what would become one of the most celebrated and analyzed songs in the history of popular music. The song was A Day in the Life, the apocalyptic, mind-bending final track on the Beatles' forthcoming masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I read the news today, oh boy, Lennon sang, his voice laced with a strange, weary, and otherworldly melancholy, about a lucky man who made the grade, and though the news was rather sad, well, I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. The lyrics perfectly captured the surreal, detached shock of learning about a sudden, violent death through the impersonal filter of the daily news. The next lines made the reference explicit. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. The lucky man who made the grade was Tara, the Guinness heir, whose father was a member of the House of Lords. His horrific death, a moment of profound and visceral tragedy for his family and friends, was transformed by Lennon's artistry into something else entirely, a universal commentary on modern life, on alienation, on the way we consume and process tragedy as just another piece of information in the daily media barrage. Through this one extraordinary song, Tara Brown achieved a strange and lasting immortality. He became forever linked to the cultural zenith of the 1960s, a symbol of a generation's beautiful, reckless, and ultimately tragic flame that burned twice as bright and for half as long. His death added another, more mythic and culturally resonant layer to the Guinness family story, cementing the idea that for this star-crossed dynasty, even their personal tragedies were somehow destined to be played out on the world's biggest stage. The curse, it seemed, now had its own soundtrack. Not all the tragedies that befell the Guinness family were loud, explosive events that made global headlines or were immortalized in the cultural zeitgeist. Some were quiet, insidious, and deeply personal, playing out far from the glare of the public eye in the lonely spaces of the human heart. The story of Lady Henrietta Guinness is one such tragedy. It is not a story of political intrigue or reckless hedonism, but of a long, solitary, and courageous battle with physical pain and the crushing weight of mental anguish. Hers is a story that serves as a haunting reminder that no amount of wealth, no degree of privilege can build a fortress against the darkest corners of the human mind. Henrietta, or Hetty, as she was known to her friends, Guinness was born in 1942 into one of the most rarefied branches of the dynasty. Her grandfather was Walter Guinness, the first Baron Moyne, the statesman assassinated in Cairo. Her father was Brian Guinness, the second Baron, a poet, novelist, and one of the original bright young things of the 1920s. Her mother was Diana Mitford, one of the famous and infamous Mitford sisters, a celebrated beauty who later caused a monumental scandal by leaving Brian for the British fascist leader, Sir Oswald Mosley. Following her parents' divorce, Brian remarried, and Henrietta and her brother Jonathan grew up in a world of almost unimaginable luxury and cultural sophistication, dividing their time between Biddesden House, a magnificent country estate in Wiltshire, and a grand house in Dublin. Like the golden Guinness girls of the previous generation, Henrietta was celebrated for her ethereal beauty, her intelligence, and her place at the very center of the glittering social circle that the press dubbed the Guinness set. This was the post-war generation of the family's heirs, a glamorous and interconnected group of young aristocrats and socialites who flitted between London townhouses, Irish castles, and continental villas. From the outside, Henrietta's life appeared to be a fairy tale. She was presented at court as a debutante. She was a fixture at the most exclusive parties. Her photograph appeared in the society pages, and she seemed destined for a life of effortless grace, a brilliant marriage, and comfortable happiness. But a single, catastrophic event in her youth would shatter that illusion and alter the course of her life forever, setting her on a long and painful path that would end in the Umbrian Hills. In the summer of 1963, when she was just 21 years old, Henrietta was driving in the south of France with her close friend, Princess Teresa zu Sayn-Wittgenstein. Near the town of Aix-en-Provence, they were involved in a devastating car accident. The crash was horrific. Henrietta was lucky to survive, but the injuries she sustained were life-changing. Her body was badly broken. She endured a long and agonizing recovery, undergoing multiple surgeries and spending months in the hospital. When she finally emerged, she was no longer the same vibrant, carefree young woman who had set off on a summer holiday. She was left with severe and permanent physical disabilities. She walked with a significant limp and was in a state of constant chronic pain that would plague her for the rest of her life. For any young person, this would be a cruel blow. But for a woman like Henrietta, whose identity was so intertwined with the grace, beauty, and physical ease of her social world, the psychological impact was catastrophic. The world of hunt balls, ski trips, and garden parties, the very fabric of her existence, was now largely closed off to her. She could no longer participate in the effortless, active social life of her peers. Every step was a painful reminder of her body's betrayal, a constant echo of the crash. The physical pain was a torment, but it was the emotional and psychological toll that proved to be the most destructive. The accident plunged Henrietta into a deep, recurring, and clinical depression. In the 1960s and 70s, mental health was a subject shrouded in ignorance and stigma, especially within the reserved, stiff upper lip culture of the British aristocracy. Emotional suffering was something to be borne in private, not discussed or treated openly. Henrietta likely felt a profound sense of isolation, trapped in a cycle of physical pain that fueled her mental anguish, and mental anguish that amplified her physical pain. The vibrant, glittering world she had once inhabited became not a source of pleasure, but a source of profound anxiety and a painful reminder of all she had lost. The future she had once taken for granted, a future that would almost certainly have included marriage, children, and a role as a society hostess, seemed to evaporate before her eyes. She became increasingly reclusive, retreating from the social world that she felt no longer had a place for her or she for it. She sought solace and anonymity away from the pressures of London and the expectations of her class. She found a measure of peace in Italy, falling in love with the art, the culture, and the gentle landscape of Umbria, the green heart of the country. She bought a farmhouse, found a circle of expatriate friends, and tried to build a new, quieter life for herself. She settled near the ancient and breathtakingly beautiful town of Spoleto, a place famous for its annual arts festival, the Festival dei Due Mondi, Festival of the Two Worlds, and for its stunning medieval and Roman architecture. It was, on the surface, an idyllic setting for a quiet convalescence of the soul. But even in this sun-dappled Italian paradise, her inner demons, the twin ghosts of pain and depression, pursued her relentlessly. Her friends and family were aware of her struggles, but the true depth of her despair, the sheer weight of the burden she carried every single day, remained a secret she kept locked inside. Spoleto is dominated by a breathtaking and formidable piece of medieval engineering, the Ponte dei Tori, or Bridge of Towers. Built in the 14th century, this massive structure is both a bridge and an aqueduct, a series of 10 towering stone arches that march across a deep wooded gorge, connecting the town's fortress, the Rocca Albornoziana, to the forested hillside of Monteluco. It is a place of almost terrifying beauty. To stand on it is to be suspended between heaven and earth, with the ancient town on one side and the sacred forest on the other. It is a marvel of human ingenuity and a place of deep contemplation. But its staggering height, over 80 meters, or 260 feet, from the bottom of the gorge also gives it a dark and formidable power. Over the centuries, it had become a place of pilgrimage, not just for artists and tourists, but for those whose despair had led them to seek a final dramatic end. It was here, on the afternoon of May 3rd, 1978, that Lady Henrietta Guinness's long and silent suffering came to its devastating conclusion. The details of her final hours are heartbreaking in their simplicity. She drove to the bridge, parked her car, and walked out onto the pedestrian walkway that runs along its length. She was a familiar, if somewhat melancholic figure in the town. No one would have thought anything was amiss. Then, in a final desperate act of will, she climbed the parapet and threw herself into the void. She was 36 years old. Her death sent a wave of shock and grief through her family and the tight-knit community of Spoleto. Unlike the public dramas of her grandfather's assassination or Tara Brown's spectacular car crash, Henrietta's end was a solitary act of quiet desperation. It was a tragedy that did not play out on the world stage, but in the private abyss of a troubled mind. Her suicide brought into sharp focus a different, more insidious aspect of the so-called Guinness curse. This was not a curse of external violence or flamboyant self-destruction, but of an internal, perhaps inherited fragility. It spoke of a potential for profound melancholy, a vulnerability to despair that seemed to run through certain branches of the family tree, a darkness that no amount of money, beauty, or privilege could ever hope to illuminate. Henrietta's story is a profoundly poignant and deeply human one. Her life was not defined by scandal or excess, but by a quiet, dignified, and ultimately losing battle against forces she could not control. Her death didn't inspire a rock and roll anthem or alter the course of Middle Eastern politics, but it added another layer of deep, authentic sorrow to the family's complex and tragic legacy. It was a tragedy that resonated not in the newspaper headlines, but in the hearts of those who knew her and understood that the heaviest burdens are often the ones that are carried invisibly, in silence. The fall from the Bridge of Towers was a literal one, a brutal final physical act, but it symbolized a much longer, slower, and more painful descent, a journey into darkness that had begun 15 years earlier on a sun-drenched road in the south of France with the screech of tires and the shattering of glass. Her story stands as a quiet but powerful testament to the fact that even in a life that seems blessed with every gift, the capacity for human suffering remains infinite. For more than 2 centuries, the Guinness name had been a byword for more than just a world-famous stout. It represented a unique and powerful brand of capitalism, one built on quality, integrity, and a kind of benevolent, paternalistic responsibility to its workers and its community. The company, even after it had passed from direct family control and become a publicly traded corporation, had maintained a formidable reputation for being a solid, reliable, and fundamentally decent institution. But in the supercharged greed is good culture of the 1980s, that long-held and hard-won reputation was about to be dragged through the mud and shattered. The next great Guinness tragedy was not one of blood, but of balance sheets, not a curse of fate, but a carefully orchestrated scandal of human avarice. And it would prove that the family's priceless legacy could be threatened not just by external forces or internal demons, but by the cynical, ruthless machinations of the modern corporate world. The setting for this new drama was the City of London's financial district, known as the Square Mile. In October 1986, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government unleashed the Big Bang, a massive deregulation of the financial markets that swept away old world traditions and ushered in a new, hyper-competitive era of global finance. It was a time of huge deals, hostile takeovers, and vast, almost instantaneous fortunes being made. It was in this high-stakes environment that Guinness plc, under the leadership of a new and ferociously ambitious chief executive, found itself fighting the corporate battle of its life. The man at the helm was Ernest Saunders. Saunders was the very antithesis of the traditional Guinness image. He was not a member of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, nor was he from the old boy network of the British establishment. He was a sharp-minded, aggressive, and supremely confident marketing man, an outsider who had worked his way to the top. He was appointed CEO in 1981 and was determined to shake the somewhat sleepy traditionalist Guinness company out of its complacency and transform it into a modern, aggressive global player. He saw that the company's future lay not just in beer, but in spirits, and he set his sights on the ultimate prize, Distillers, a giant, venerable but somewhat poorly managed Scottish conglomerate that owned a portfolio of the world's most iconic whiskey and gin brands, including Johnnie Walker, Dewar's, Whitehorse, Gordon's, and Tanqueray. In late 1985, Guinness launched an audacious takeover bid for Distillers. The acquisition would be a game-changing, company-transforming event, instantly making Guinness a true beverage superpower. But they were not the only suitor. They soon found themselves locked in a fierce, bitter, and increasingly hostile bidding war with another major British company, Argyll Group, a supermarket giant run by the canny Scottish businessman James Gulliver. It was a classic corporate slugfest. Argyll was a larger, more powerful player, and its initial offer for Distillers was higher and widely considered to be the favorite to win. Ernest Saunders and his team at Guinness were desperate. They could not bear the thought of losing. The prestige, the potential profits, and Saunders' own reputation were all on the line. They were prepared to do whatever it took to secure victory, and what they did took them far beyond the boundaries of ethical business and deep into the realm of criminal conspiracy. The battle for Distillers was fought primarily with shares. In a contested takeover like this, both bidding companies offer a mix of cash and their own company stock to persuade the target company's shareholders to sell to them. This creates a simple but crucial dynamic. The higher a bidder's own share price, the more valuable its offer becomes. Saunders and his inner circle, a group of high-flying executives and city advisors, hatched an illegal, secret, and breathtakingly audacious plan to artificially inflate the price of Guinness shares, thereby making their bid appear more attractive than Argyll's. They assembled what the prosecution would later call a concert party, a secret syndicate of wealthy, powerful, and well-connected investors and financiers who, in exchange for secret rewards, agreed to buy up huge quantities of Guinness stock at critical moments during the takeover battle. This concerted buying created a false impression of massive market confidence in Guinness, pushing the share price up and up. The conspiracy, however, went much deeper. This was not a case of enthusiastic friends rallying to the cause. Guinness secretly promised these investors that they would be completely protected from any potential losses. They were offered enormous secret success fees for their help. Most egregiously, in several key instances, Guinness secretly provided the syndicate with the very money they needed to buy the shares in the first place, channeling tens of millions of pounds through a complex web of offshore companies and Swiss bank accounts. In effect, Guinness was illegally using its own funds to manipulate its own stock price. The key figures in this clandestine network were a who's who of 1980s finance. There was Gerald Ronson, a prominent British property tycoon, and one of the country's most respected businessmen, There was the American lawyer and corporate fixer Anthony Parnes. There was the veteran city financier Jack Lyons, a man known for his extensive network and his role as an advisor to politicians. And most fatefully, there was Ivan Boesky, the notorious American arbitrager, the king of the Wall Street speculators, a man who would soon become the living symbol of 80s greed and corruption. The illegal plan worked like a charm. The frantic, orchestrated buying pushed Guinness's share price to unprecedented heights, allowing Saunders to repeatedly increase the value of his offer for distillers. The financial press was amazed by the market's apparent love for Guinness. In the end, Argyle could no longer compete. In April 1986, Guinness triumphantly announced that it had won the takeover battle, acquiring distillers for a staggering £2.6 billion. Ernest Saunders was hailed as a corporate hero, a strategic genius who had slain a larger rival. He was the toast of the city, his face on the cover of business magazines. The victory seemed total, but the celebration was destined to be very, very short-lived. The intricate web of deceit was about to unravel with spectacular speed. The downfall of the Guinness conspiracy began, ironically, with a completely separate scandal unfolding 3,000 miles away, across the Atlantic. In November 1986, the financial world was rocked by the news that Ivan Boesky had been arrested for a massive insider trading scheme. Facing a lifetime in prison, Boesky struck a plea bargain with the U.S. authorities. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he agreed to cooperate fully to wear a wiretap and to expose his entire network of corrupt dealings. And one of the biggest secrets he had to trade was the story of his role in the Guinness takeover. He revealed to investigators that he had been a key member of the illegal share support operation and that he had been promised a secret success fee of around £76 million by Guinness for his services. Boesky's confession was the smoking gun. The information was passed from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to Britain's Department of Trade and Industry, DTI. The DTI immediately launched a secret, high-level investigation. In the early morning hours of December 1, 1986, DTI inspectors, using surprise powers granted under the Companies Act, raided the offices of Guinness and its advisors, seizing thousands of documents. The story exploded in the press. The details of the illegal share support scheme, the secret payments, the offshore companies, and the breathtaking scale of the deception shocked the financial world and the public alike. The company that had built its global brand on centuries of trust and integrity was now at the center of the biggest and most complex corporate fraud case in British history. Ernest Saunders was summarily fired by the Guinness board. The investigation and the subsequent trials dragged on for years, costing tens of millions of pounds. Ernest Saunders, Gerald Ronson, Anthony Parnes, and Jack Lyons, the Guinness Four, were arrested and put on trial at the Old Bailey in London. The legal proceedings were a sensation, a public dissection of the greed and corruption that had flourished in the city's Big Bang culture. Saunders's defense took a bizarre and controversial turn when he claimed he was suffering from presenile dementia, specifically Alzheimer's disease, and was therefore unfit to stand trial. He appeared in court looking frail and confused. The judge, however, ruled that he was fit enough for the trial to proceed. In August 1990, after a mammoth trial, the verdicts came in. Saunders, Ronson, and Parnes were found guilty of multiple charges, including conspiracy, theft, and false accounting. Jack Lyons was convicted in a separate trial. The sentences were seen as a powerful statement that white-collar crime would no longer be tolerated. Saunders was sentenced to 5 years in prison, which was later reduced to 2.5 on appeal. Gerald Ronson received a 1-year sentence. After being released from prison after serving just 10 months, Ernest Saunders made a seemingly miraculous recovery from his dementia, going on to work as a business consultant, a recovery that his critics pointed to as evidence that his illness had been a cynical ploy to evade justice. The scandal left a deep and lasting stain on the Guinness name. Even though the Guinness family itself was not directly involved in the fraud, their day-to-day control had long since passed. It was their company, their heritage, their legacy that had been so publicly disgraced. The affair exposed a culture of corporate avarice that was a million miles away from the philanthropic principles of Benjamin Lee and Edward Cecil Guinness. It triggered major reforms in UK corporate governance and company law, specifically designed to prevent such a scandal from ever happening again. For the Guinness dynasty, this was a new and humiliating kind of tragedy. No one had died, but something invaluable had been stolen and perhaps irretrievably lost. A global reputation for integrity that had been painstakingly built over more than 2 centuries. The curse, it seemed, could manifest itself in many forms. It could come in the form of an assassin's bullet, a mangled sports car, or a fall from a great height. Or it could come in the form of a secret ledger and a corrupt stock trade, tarnishing the golden harp that had once shone so brightly and so purely for the entire world to see. And so, we end where we began, with a simple pint of Guinness, a global icon born from one man's audacious bet. But behind the perfect pour, we now see the parallel story, a relentless pattern of assassination, accidents, suicides, and scandal. So, what is the Guinness curse? Is it a supernatural force, a price paid for too much fortune? Or is the truth something more chilling and more human? Perhaps the curse is simply the consequence of living under the unbearable weight of a famous name. Their fortune didn't just build palaces, it built a gilded cage that amplified every human flaw. Wealth enabled the reckless lifestyle that ended in a fatal car crash. Power made them a target for assassins. Privilege couldn't protect them from the lonely despair that led to a fall from a bridge. And the pressure to maintain the empire led to the greed that tarnished their legacy. The story of the Guinness dynasty is not a ghost story. It's a cautionary tale written in blood and balance sheets. It's a stark reminder that immense success often casts the darkest of shadows. And the tragic, inescapable truth is that the very thing that made the Guinness name immortal is also what made the family so tragically, vulnerably human.